Master navigator Vasco Medeiros reflects on his reputation for precise cartography while preparing for an unusual commission in the bustling port of Lisbon. The harbor breathed with the rhythm of empire at its zenith, lanterns swaying from mastheads like suspended stars, while their light fractured across dark water that carried the scent of distant lands and closer salt. Lisbon's quays stretched into shadow, lined with vessels whose holds bore cinnamon from Ceylon, ivory from Africa, and silver from the New World. Riches that flowed through Portuguese fingers, according to charts drawn by men who transformed chaos into order through ink and mathematics. Master Vasco Medeiros stood at his window overlooking the Tagus, watching crews secure lines against tide and wind, their movements following patterns as precise as the coastal surveys that had made his reputation throughout the kingdom. At 53 years, Medeiros possessed hands that could translate ocean into parchment with accuracy that admirals trusted above their own experience. His charts serving vessels that carried Portugal's influence across waters where miscalculation meant not mere commercial loss, but death for crews whose families would never know their fate. 27 years of voyages had taught him that the sea respected only truth, that phantom islands and mythical passages existed solely in the imagination of men who confused desire with discovery, who drew coastlines where none existed because kings demanded territories that reality had not provided. His workshop held instruments calibrated against known stars, logs verified through multiple observations, and charts whose precision enabled navigation through waters that had claimed lesser cartographers, whose romantic notions about undiscovered lands served poetry rather than practical seamanship. Tonight, however, his desk held correspondence that challenged the methodical skepticism through which he approached reports of the impossible. Sealed orders bearing the royal insignia alongside testimonies that refused comfortable dismissal through conventional explanations of navigational error or wishful thinking. The commission promised payment sufficient for retirement, yet its requirements troubled consciousness, trained to distinguish between what charts could reliably represent and what belonged to speculation, better left to scholars whose theoretical interests did not determine whether ships returned safely to harbor or disappeared forever into oceanic vastness that punished cartographic fantasy with death and financial ruin. Medeiros receives orders to investigate scattered reports of an uncharted island whose existence has been suggested through fragmentary logbook entries and testimonies from surviving sailors. The Admiralty Chamber occupied the ground floor of a limestone building whose windows faced the harbor, its walls lined with charts that documented Portuguese expansion across oceans whose mastery had elevated a small kingdom into global empire through superior navigation and cartographic precision that enabled reliable communication between Lisbon and territories spanning 3 continents. Admiral Dom Francisco de Almeida presided over proceedings that combined bureaucratic efficiency with recognition that state resources demanded careful allocation among competing priorities for exploration, defense, and trade route maintenance serving economic objectives, whose success depended upon accurate geographic knowledge rather than speculation about territories whose existence remained unconfirmed through multiple reliable observations. The evidence presented challenged conventional assessment of maritime reports through consistency that exceeded what individual error or fabrication could explain. Fragments of testimony from crews whose ships had returned with reduced numbers and stories that mapped poorly against established understanding of Atlantic geography and current patterns. Captain Juan Pereira described sighting land at coordinates where previous surveys had found only deep water, his log containing sketches of coastline that possessed internal consistency, yet corresponded to no known territory, despite decades of Portuguese exploration throughout the region, whose resources served Crown objectives requiring comprehensive geographic documentation, rather than gaps that competitors might exploit through superior knowledge. Most troubling were pages recovered from flotsam bearing Portuguese markings, waterlogged parchment whose ink remained partially legible, despite exposure to elements that should have destroyed written records within days of submersion. According to experience with materials lost during storm damage, affecting vessels whose survival depended upon watertight storage of navigation documents. The fragments contained references to Ilha que não deveria existir, an island that should not exist, alongside coordinates that varied slightly yet clustered around position that multiple independent sources described with terminology suggesting not discovery, but recognition, as if mariners had encountered familiar landmark, whose presence violated geographic understanding developed through systematic exploration spanning generations of Portuguese expansion across previously unknown waters. Medeiros accepted the commission with reservations that honored both professional skepticism and recognition that royal authority demanded investigation of reports whose implications affected state interests in maintaining navigation superiority over Spanish and Dutch competitors seeking similar advantages through cartographic precision, enabling reliable communication with distant territories whose resources served metropolitan economic objectives. His task involved compilation of available evidence into provisional chart that could guide test expedition designed to confirm or dismiss claims whose persistence suggested either genuine discovery or systematic error affecting multiple independent observers whose reliability had been established through previous service to Crown interests requiring accurate rather than imaginative geographic documentation, serving practical rather than romantic purposes. Working alone in his cartography room, Medeiros attempts to plot the island's location, but finds his hand drawing lines that drift from calculated positions, as if the ink seeks its own destination. The cartography chamber held silence that accumulated after midnight, when harbor activity diminished to essential watch duties and administrative buildings emptied of clerks, whose daylight hours served bureaucratic efficiency rather than the contemplative precision required for transforming fragmentary evidence into navigational guidance that could determine whether expeditions returned with profit or disappeared into Atlantic vastness that respected no authority save accurate measurement. Medeiros arranged his instruments according to ritual developed through decades of practice. Brass dividers whose points traced circles of possibility, astrolabe calibrated against fixed stars, and compass whose needle sought magnetic truth with consistency that served mathematical calculation rather than wishful speculation about territories whose existence required proof through multiple verified observations rather than romantic interpretation of ambiguous evidence. The plotting began with established reference points whose accuracy had been confirmed through triangulation against known coastlines, astronomical observations, and dead reckoning calculations that honored physical laws governing wind patterns, current behavior, and celestial mechanics, whose reliability enabled practical navigation serving commercial rather than theoretical purposes. Working outward from Portuguese territorial waters, whose charts reflected decades of systematic survey work, he applied standard projection techniques to accommodate Earth's curvature while maintaining proportional relationships that preserved navigational utility, despite inevitable distortions affecting flat representation of spherical reality, whose complexity challenged artistic accuracy while demanding mathematical precision serving practical seamanship requirements. Yet as calculations approached the disputed coordinates, his plotting hand began making corrections that conscious analysis could not justify through available evidence or mathematical logic governing geometric relationships between established positions and theoretical destinations, described through testimonies whose consistency exceeded normal reliability, yet remained insufficient for definitive confirmation of territorial claims serving state objectives. The pen moved with micro-adjustments that positioned the hypothetical island slightly different from where triangulation indicated it should appear. Ink flowing toward coordinates that felt inevitable, despite contradicting computational results whose accuracy had been verified through multiple cross-checks, eliminating human error as explanation for discrepancies between mathematical prediction and intuitive placement. Most unsettling was recognition that the corrections felt necessary rather than arbitrary, as if geographic reality possessed structure that mathematical projection could approximate yet never fully capture without accounting for forces that operated beyond conventional understanding of space and position governing normal cartographic practice. The completed sketch showed coastline whose configuration seemed simultaneously foreign and familiar, terrain that consciousness insisted belonged at those specific coordinates, despite absence of logical foundation for such certainty, leaving Medeiros with chart that honored both rational methodology and inexplicable conviction that the island existed precisely where ink had placed it. Regardless of whether mathematical analysis supported such conclusion through verifiable evidence serving practical navigation objectives rather than artistic speculation about territories whose reality remained unconfirmed through direct observation. Research in older maritime records reveals that reports of the mysterious island stretch back generations, with consistent patterns of erasure and administrative suppression surrounding each incident. The archive occupied basement chambers whose stone walls had absorbed decades of maritime documentation, their shelves holding logbooks that chronicled Portuguese expansion through waters whose mastery had transformed kingdom into empire-spanning territories, whose resources flowed toward Lisbon according to navigation routes developed through systematic exploration and cartographic precision that enabled reliable communication between metropolitan center and distant colonies serving crown interests requiring accurate geographic knowledge rather than speculative mapping of unconfirmed territories whose existence remained disputed through bureaucratic channels favoring established understanding over disruptive claims, challenging official geographic doctrine. Deeper investigation revealed patterns that challenged comfortable assumption that reports of phantom islands represented isolated incidents of navigational error or crew hallucination. Documentation showing similar testimonies appearing in maritime records spanning 3 generations of Portuguese exploration whose consistency exceeded what individual mistake or deliberate fabrication could explain through conventional analysis of human psychology governing false claims affecting institutional credibility. Ships reported sighting land at coordinates that varied within narrow range, yet consistently described terrain whose characteristics matched, despite originating from independent observers whose reliability had been established through previous service to Crown objectives, requiring accurate rather than imaginative documentation of geographic discoveries serving practical navigation needs. Most troubling were marginal notations in official logs, whose content had been systematically altered through careful erasure and overwriting that preserved grammatical coherence, while eliminating references to territorial encounters that contradicted established understanding of Atlantic geography, governing Portuguese territorial claims and navigation policies. Administrative correspondence revealed bureaucratic pressure to correct geographic documentation whose content challenged official position that Atlantic waters contained no undiscovered territories, whose existence could affect established trade routes or navigation procedures, serving economic objectives requiring geographic stability, rather than disruptive revelations threatening institutional credibility, built upon systematic exploration whose accuracy enabled imperial expansion across previously unknown waters. The pattern extended beyond individual logbook entries to encompass administrative policy regarding maritime anomalies, whose investigation received minimal resources, while their documentation faced systematic suppression through filing. procedures that relegated disruptive reports to archive sections, whose accessibility remained restricted to personnel whose security clearances enabled examination of materials deemed sensitive to Crown interests, requiring geographic certainty rather than confusion, generated through unverified claims about territories whose existence could not be confirmed through conventional exploration methods. Medeiros recognized institutional effort to eliminate records whose content challenged official geographic understanding, yet persistence of testimonies across multiple generations suggested phenomenon whose reality transcended bureaucratic capacity for suppression through administrative convenience favoring established doctrine over disruptive evidence threatening geographic foundations upon which Portuguese navigation superiority depended for maintaining imperial communications and commercial efficiency, serving metropolitan economic objectives. Medeiros presents his findings to Admiralty officials, whose reactions range from pragmatic skepticism to superstitious unease as they debate authorizing an expedition based on his provisional chart. The council chamber gathered officials whose authority encompassed Portuguese maritime policy, affecting exploration priorities, territorial claims, and navigation security serving Crown interests, requiring careful balance between aggressive expansion and resource conservation that honored both economic opportunity and strategic caution governing decisions whose consequences affected imperial stability through geographic knowledge enabling or limiting communication with distant territories whose loyalty depended upon reliable supply and administrative contact. Admiral Dom Francisco presided with authority earned through successful campaigns that had established Portuguese influence across waters where navigation errors meant strategic disadvantage rather than mere commercial inconvenience, while younger officials displayed ambition constrained by recognition that career advancement required demonstration of judgment, serving institutional rather than personal objectives, whose pursuit could threaten collective security through reckless resource allocation. Medeiros presented evidence with systematic thoroughness that honored both scientific methodology and political sensitivity, governing official evaluation of claims challenging established geographic understanding whose accuracy served Portuguese navigation superiority, enabling imperial communications across distances that Spanish and Dutch competitors struggled to match, through inferior cartographic precision and less reliable navigation procedures serving territorial ambitions, requiring geographic knowledge that Portuguese systematic exploration had developed through decades of careful observation and mathematical analysis. The testimonial fragments, archival patterns, and provisional chart received examination that reflected institutional skepticism balanced by recognition that dismissal without investigation could eliminate opportunities for territorial expansion serving Crown interests, whose success depended upon geographic advantages that competitors might discover through superior exploration techniques. Debate revealed tension between rational assessment of evidence whose quality remained insufficient for definitive confirmation and institutional pressure to investigate claims whose implications affected Portuguese strategic position in Atlantic waters, where territorial discoveries could influence trade route control and colonial communication, serving economic objectives requiring geographic superiority over competing powers seeking similar advantages through exploration, whose success threatened Portuguese imperial consolidation. Captain Álvaro de Mendoza argued for investigation through limited expedition, whose cost remained acceptable despite uncertain returns, while bureaucratic officials emphasized resource allocation priorities that favored established operations over speculative ventures, whose failure could damage institutional credibility built upon systematic exploration, whose accuracy enabled Portuguese navigation leadership. The session concluded with authorization for reconnaissance fleet, whose mission involved verification rather than territorial occupation, minimal resource commitment designed to confirm or dismiss claims whose persistence suggested either genuine discovery or systematic error affecting multiple independent observers whose reliability required investigation through direct observation rather than continued administrative debate serving bureaucratic convenience over practical resolution of geographic uncertainty threatening Portuguese navigation confidence. Medeiros received orders to provide complete navigation package including detailed chart, sailing instructions, and contingency procedures, enabling expedition leadership to proceed with confidence despite uncertain territorial reality, whose investigation served Crown interests requiring resolution of geographic questions affecting maritime policy and territorial planning objectives spanning Atlantic waters, whose mastery determined Portuguese imperial sustainability against increasing competition from European powers seeking similar advantages through superior geographic knowledge and navigation precision. 3 ships depart Lisbon using Medeiros's chart, their final communications suggesting they reached the island's location but encountered something that defied normal geographic understanding. Dawn preparations proceeded with efficiency that characterized Portuguese maritime operations, whose success depended upon systematic attention to logistical details serving expedition objectives requiring careful coordination between navigation planning, supply allocation, and crew selection, favoring experience over enthusiasm among sailors whose survival depended upon professional competence rather than romantic adventure seeking territorial discovery for personal glory. Captain Fernão de Noronha commanded lead vessel São Gabriel, whose crew included veterans of African and Brazilian voyages, their expertise serving reconnaissance mission requiring reliable observation rather than territorial occupation, whose aggressive pursuit could compromise diplomatic relations with competing powers claiming similar exploration rights throughout Atlantic waters, whose territorial status remained disputed through European negotiations affecting Portuguese imperial planning. The fleet's departure attracted minimal official attention, despite curiosity among harbor personnel whose experience included numerous expeditions seeking territorial expansion through systematic exploration of previously unknown waters. Yet this mission carried atmosphere of uncertainty that distinguished it from routine commercial voyages serving established trade routes, whose navigation followed charts verified through decades of reliable operation. Medeiros watched from quayside as vessels decreased into Atlantic immensity, whose horizons concealed geographic realities that mathematical projection could approximate yet never fully predict without direct observation, confirming theoretical calculations through practical encounter with territorial features whose existence remained disputed through administrative channels favoring caution over aggressive exploration of unconfirmed geographic possibilities. Communication proceeded according to established procedures requiring regular position reports, enabling administrative tracking of expedition progress through Atlantic waters, whose navigation demanded systematic attention to weather patterns, current behavior, and astronomical positioning serving safety objectives that prioritized crew survival over territorial achievement, whose pursuit could sacrifice human resources for uncertain geographic gains affecting Portuguese strategic position. Initial reports indicated normal sailing conditions, despite compass variations that exceeded typical magnetic irregularities affecting navigation in Atlantic waters, whose behavior generally followed predictable patterns, enabling reliable dead reckoning calculations, serving routine maritime operations throughout Portuguese territorial waters, and established shipping routes connecting metropolitan center to colonial territories. The final coherent transmission arrived 3 weeks following departure, its content suggesting successful arrival at designated coordinates, yet describing circumstances that challenged conventional understanding of geographic reality governing normal territorial encounters. We have reached the position where no land should exist, yet land rises before us with coastline that matches no previous charts, while possessing configuration that consciousness recognizes despite impossibility of such knowledge through normal observation. If this message reaches Admiralty consideration, know that we have achieved contact with territory whose existence requires investigation beyond current expedition resources, while presenting navigation challenges that exceed standard maritime procedures for territorial approach and harbor assessment serving landing operations. The transmission terminated without explanation, leaving administrative uncertainty about expedition status, whose resolution required extended communication waiting period before declaring mission failure or success according to bureaucratic procedures governing maritime operations, whose outcomes affected Portuguese territorial claims and navigation policy throughout Atlantic waters, whose mastery served imperial objectives requiring geographic certainty rather than continued speculation about territorial possibilities, whose reality remained unconfirmed through official channels. Months after the fleet's disappearance, official attempts to erase the island from maritime records encounter strange resistance, as if the geographic information refuses to be completely eliminated. Administrative pressure intensified following extended communication silence that suggested expedition failure through causes remaining unclear despite systematic monitoring of Atlantic shipping routes and diplomatic inquiries regarding territorial encounters affecting Portuguese vessels, whose disappearance could indicate hostile action by competing powers seeking advantage through elimination of Portuguese exploration capabilities, serving Crown interests requiring geographic knowledge superiority over European competitors, claiming similar navigation rights throughout disputed Atlantic waters. Official explanation emphasized conventional maritime hazards, including storm damage, navigation error, and equipment failure whose statistical likelihood exceeded speculation about territorial anomalies whose existence lacked confirmation through reliable observation. Yet bureaucratic concern focused upon institutional credibility, whose protection required elimination of documentation, suggesting geographic uncertainty affecting Portuguese navigation confidence among international maritime community. Medeiros received orders requiring chart revision that eliminated theoretical island, whose inclusion in official navigation documentation could encourage similar expeditions whose failure would compromise Portuguese institutional reputation for cartographic accuracy serving maritime operations throughout Atlantic waters, whose reliable navigation enabled imperial communications and commercial efficiency spanning territories, whose administration depended upon geographic knowledge, whose accuracy determined administrative success or failure. The revision process initially proceeded according to standard cartographic procedures, involving careful removal of erroneous information through ink scraping and parchment preparation, enabling accurate redrawing of affected areas according to established geographic understanding. Verified through multiple independent observations, rather than speculative territorial claims whose reality remained unconfirmed through direct investigation. Yet attempts at chart modification encountered resistance that exceeded normal technical difficulties, affecting parchment manipulation and ink removal. Geographic information seeming to resist elimination through conventional archival procedures, whose effectiveness had been established through decades of cartographic maintenance serving Portuguese navigation requirements. Ink scraping revealed underlying impressions that reproduced island configuration despite physical removal of surface material, while redrawing efforts resulted in distorted coastline relationships that violated established geographic proportions and navigation angles whose accuracy enabled reliable positioning calculations serving maritime operations throughout Atlantic waters, whose systematic survey had established Portuguese territorial understanding through mathematical precision rather than artistic interpretation. Most disturbing was recognition that complete elimination of island reference required revision of surrounding geographic features whose established accuracy served Portuguese navigation throughout Atlantic waters, spanning imperial territories, whose communication depended upon cartographic precision, enabling reliable positioning and course calculation, serving administrative and commercial objectives, requiring geographic stability, rather than systematic uncertainty affecting maritime confidence. Under candlelight that flickered with harbor wind entering through imperfectly sealed windows, the provisional chart displayed stubborn ghost impressions where island coastline had been drawn, faint outlines that refused complete erasure despite repeated attempts at parchment preparation and ink removal, whose failure suggested geographic information whose reality transcended normal cartographic representation through mechanisms that operated beyond conventional understanding of chart accuracy and territorial documentation, serving practical navigation rather than theoretical speculation about geographic possibilities whose existence challenged established understanding of Atlantic waters, whose mastery served Portuguese imperial objectives, requiring certainty rather than continued mystery, affecting institutional credibility and navigation confidence throughout maritime operations spanning territorial distances, whose reliable communication demanded geographic knowledge, whose accuracy determined imperial sustainability against increasing European competition. Months after the expedition's disappearance, Vasco is tasked with sanitizing maritime records to eliminate references to the island, discovering how deeply the anomaly has infected Portuguese navigation documentation. The administrative directive arrived without ceremony through routine correspondence channels, yet its implications transformed Vasco's role from navigator to institutional memory keeper, whose responsibilities encompassed systematic revision of maritime documentation, serving Crown interests requiring geographic certainty rather than continued speculation about territorial anomalies whose existence challenged Portuguese navigation superiority, enabling imperial communications across Atlantic waters. The task demanded meticulous attention to logbook entries, chart annotations, and administrative correspondence spanning decades of exploration, whose accumulated evidence suggested persistent geographic irregularities affecting Portuguese territorial understanding through testimonies that official policy preferred to reinterpret as conventional navigation errors rather than systematic challenges to established Atlantic geography. Working through archive materials revealed patterns that exceeded isolated incident analysis, documentation showing similar coordinate references appearing across multiple voyages, whose independent origins challenged explanation through coincidental error, affecting unrelated navigation operations, serving different administrative objectives throughout Portuguese imperial expansion. Marginal notations in ship logs consistently identified the same oceanic region through latitude and longitude references that varied within narrow parameters, yet described atmospheric conditions, current behavior, and compass variations, suggesting environmental characteristics that contradicted established understanding of Atlantic waters, whose behavior generally followed predictable patterns, enabling reliable navigation calculations, serving commercial and military operations, spanning territorial distances, requiring accurate positioning for successful completion. The falsification process encountered resistance that exceeded normal archival modification procedures. Geographic information seeming to reassert itself despite systematic elimination efforts through ink removal, coordinate alteration, and textual revision designed to maintain grammatical coherence while eliminating references that challenged official Atlantic geography. Each correction required subsequent adjustments, affecting surrounding navigational data, whose accuracy enabled Portuguese maritime operations throughout established shipping routes, creating cumulative distortion that threatened chart reliability, serving practical navigation requirements across territorial waters, whose mastery determined imperial sustainability against increasing European competition, seeking similar advantages through superior geographic knowledge and cartographic precision, enabling reliable, Communication with distant colonial territories whose administration depended upon accurate rather than politically convenient geographic documentation. Storm-damaged wreckage from the lost expedition washes ashore, carrying waterlogged logbook pages that describe reaching the island and encountering navigational impossibilities. The autumn storm season delivered more than seasonal weather disruption to Portuguese coastal waters. Fishing vessels returning with debris whose origin suggested Atlantic wreckage rather than local maritime accidents, affecting domestic shipping operations whose loss patterns remained familiar through decades of experience with Portuguese coastal navigation hazards. Among waterlogged timber and corroded metal fixtures that bore Portuguese naval markings, Cabo da Roca fishermen recovered parchment fragments whose partial preservation indicated recent origin despite exposure to oceanic conditions that typically destroyed written materials within days of submersion, according to experience with documents lost during routine storm damage, affecting vessels whose survival depended upon watertight storage, protecting navigation materials from environmental destruction. The recovered pages contained handwriting that archival analysis confirmed as belonging to Captain Fernão de Noronha, whose expedition leadership had been established through administrative records documenting crew assignments and mission authorization serving reconnaissance objectives requiring experienced personnel capable of reliable observation and documentation under challenging oceanic conditions. The legible portions described navigation experiences that challenged conventional understanding of Atlantic geographic behavior through systematic irregularities affecting compass readings, current direction, and celestial positioning, whose mathematical relationships enabled normal dead reckoning calculations serving maritime operations throughout established Portuguese territorial waters, whose behavior followed predictable patterns supporting reliable navigation procedures. Most disturbing were final entries whose content suggested successful arrival at designated coordinates, yet described circumstances that contradicted normal territorial encounter protocols through geographic conditions that prevented conventional landing operations while creating navigation hazards whose nature exceeded standard maritime challenges affecting Portuguese exploration throughout Atlantic waters, whose mastery had enabled imperial expansion across previously unknown territories. We have achieved contact with land that rises where none should exist according to established charts, the fragment reported. Yet approach proves impossible through currents that move contrary to wind direction while maintaining coastal position that prevents departure according to conventional navigation procedures requiring wind and tide cooperation for successful harbor operations. The text terminated without explanation, leaving administrative uncertainty about expedition outcome, whose resolution required continued investigation despite official preference for conventional explanations, attributing maritime loss to storm damage or equipment failure, rather than geographic anomalies challenging established territorial understanding, serving Portuguese navigation confidence throughout Atlantic waters. Alone in his map room, Vasco experiences increasingly vivid dreams and waking visions of the island, blending precise navigational details with disturbing sensory impressions that feel more like memory than imagination. The revised charts displayed Atlantic geography, whose official accuracy served Portuguese navigation requirements through systematic elimination of territorial references that challenged established understanding of oceanic space and current behavior, enabling reliable maritime operations across imperial territories, whose communication depended upon geographic certainty rather than speculative mapping of unconfirmed possibilities. Yet consciousness trained through decades of cartographic precision retained awareness of absent features whose elimination from official documentation could not erase mental impression of coastline configuration and coordinate positioning that felt inevitable despite administrative pressure favoring geographic conformity over disruptive evidence threatening institutional credibility, built upon systematic exploration whose accuracy enabled Portuguese territorial claims throughout disputed Atlantic waters. Sleep brought navigation experiences whose sensory authenticity exceeded normal dream imagery, through incorporation of professional knowledge regarding celestial positioning, current analysis, and wind pattern interpretation, whose technical accuracy suggested direct observation rather than imaginative speculation about oceanic conditions affecting maritime operations in unfamiliar waters. The visions placed consciousness aboard vessel approaching, coordinates that mathematical calculation insisted contained only deep water, yet horizon displayed characteristics suggesting territorial presence through atmospheric disturbance and wave pattern modification that indicated interaction between oceanic forces and coastal geography, whose existence contradicted established Atlantic mapping serving Portuguese navigation throughout imperial territories requiring accurate rather than speculative geographic documentation. Most unsettling were details whose specificity exceeded conscious knowledge yet possessed internal consistency, suggesting authentic geographic observation through mechanisms that operated beyond normal sensory experience or professional training enabling conventional navigation competence. The island appeared with coastline configuration that matched recovered logbook sketches while displaying additional features including harbor approaches, elevation patterns, and vegetation characteristics that consciousness recognized despite rational understanding. That such familiarity required direct observation, impossible through current circumstances, limiting geographic knowledge to administrative documentation and archival research, rather than personal exploration serving territorial confirmation through reliable investigation methods. Waking brought persistent awareness of coordinate positioning and compass, bearings that aligned with original provisional chart. Despite official elimination of such references from approved navigation documentation, suggesting geographic information whose reality transcended administrative convenience favoring institutional security over accurate territorial representation, serving practical navigation requirements throughout Portuguese Atlantic operations. Vasco seeks advice from Tomé Rodrigues, an elderly archive clerk, who reveals that the island has haunted Portuguese records for generations and warns against the dangers of cartographic obsession. The maritime archives occupied basement chambers whose accumulated documentation spanned Portuguese exploration from initial African expeditions through contemporary Atlantic operations. Their preservation overseen by personnel whose careers encompassed institutional memory regarding navigation anomalies that official policy preferred to minimize through administrative classification, rather than systematic investigation serving geographic accuracy. Tomé Rodrigues had served 43 years among documents whose content chronicled Portuguese territorial expansion across previously unknown waters. His expertise encompassing archival organization and retrieval procedures that enabled administrative access to historical materials whose significance affected current navigation policy and territorial planning. Serving Crown interests requiring accurate rather than politically convenient geographic understanding throughout disputed Atlantic waters, whose mastery determined imperial sustainability against increasing European competition. Private consultation revealed knowledge that challenged official narrative regarding isolated incident affecting single expedition through navigation error or equipment failure. Rodrigues describing persistent patterns affecting Portuguese maritime documentation across multiple generations, whose testimonies suggested geographic anomalies, whose nature exceeded conventional explanation through established navigation science or oceanic behavior, predictable through systematic observation and mathematical analysis. The island appears and disappears according to schedules that honor neither tide nor season. He explained with caution that reflected recognition of sensitive information whose disclosure violated administrative protocols governing classified materials. Yet its influence remains constant through coordinate references that surface despite systematic elimination efforts, serving institutional security, requiring geographic certainty rather than continued mystery, affecting Portuguese navigation confidence. The warning carried weight earned through experience with previous navigators whose professional competence had been established through successful completion of challenging assignments serving Portuguese territorial expansion, yet whose involvement with disputed geographic anomalies had resulted in personal consequences ranging from career termination through administrative reassignment to complete disappearance during subsequent maritime operations, whose outcomes remained unclear through official investigation, limited by security classifications protecting institutional interests over individual welfare. Once consciousness accepts the island's reality through cartographic representation, Rodriguez cautioned, geographic knowledge becomes obligation requiring resolution through direct encounter rather than administrative convenience favoring comfortable distance from territorial possibilities, whose investigation threatens both personal stability and institutional security through revelation of oceanic forces that operate beyond conventional understanding of navigation science, serving practical maritime operations throughout established Portuguese territorial waters, whose predictable behavior enables reliable communication and commercial efficiency. Political and economic pressures forced the Admiralty to authorize another expedition to the island, this time requiring Vasco himself to sail as chief navigator despite his reluctant protests. The Second Assembly convened under circumstances that reflected institutional pressure exceeding normal administrative deliberation regarding exploration priorities, economic concerns, and diplomatic competition demanding resolution of territorial questions, whose persistence threatened Portuguese strategic position in Atlantic waters, where geographic uncertainty could enable Spanish or Dutch advantages through superior navigation knowledge and territorial claims serving imperial objectives requiring comprehensive rather than speculative understanding of oceanic resources and strategic positions. Merchant representatives expressed concern regarding shipping insurance rates that reflected maritime risk assessment, incorporating mysterious vessel disappearances affecting Portuguese commercial operations, whose reliability served economic prosperity, requiring predictable rather than anomalous oceanic conditions throughout established trade routes connecting metropolitan center to colonial territories, whose administration depended upon secure communication and supply chains. Administrative analysis emphasized strategic implications of continued geographic uncertainty affecting Portuguese territorial claims throughout disputed Atlantic waters, where undefined boundaries could enable competing powers to assert navigation rights and resource access through superior exploration achievements, serving imperial expansion, whose success required accurate geographic knowledge rather than continued speculation about territorial possibilities, whose existence remained unconfirmed through reliable observation and systematic investigation. The commission structure reflected compromise between aggressive exploration serving territorial acquisition and conservative resource allocation honoring fiscal responsibility, while acknowledging that continued uncertainty regarding Atlantic geography threatened Portuguese navigation superiority, enabling imperial communications and commercial efficiency across territorial distances, whose reliable management determined colonial sustainability and metropolitan economic prosperity. Vasco's participation became mandatory through recognition that cartographic expertise whose accuracy had produced provisional chart, enabling first expedition contact, required personal verification, ensuring navigation precision adequate for successful territorial approach, and comprehensive geographic documentation serving administrative requirements whose scope encompassed detailed coastal mapping, harbor assessment, and resource evaluation, enabling informed policy decisions regarding territorial occupation or diplomatic negotiation. Despite protests regarding age-related limitations affecting oceanic service and professional preferences favoring cartographic analysis over maritime exploration, administrative authority insisted that personal involvement remained essential for mission success, requiring navigation expertise whose accuracy could not be delegated to personnel lacking systematic familiarity with disputed territorial coordinates and environmental characteristics, whose unusual behavior demanded specialized knowledge exceeding conventional seamanship training and navigation experience. Serving routine Portuguese maritime operations throughout established Atlantic territories. The new expedition leaves Lisbon with subtle anomalies manifesting from the beginning of their voyage, accumulating navigation irregularities that seem to draw them inexorably toward the island's coordinates. The preparation proceeded with efficiency that honored both administrative urgency and recognition that maritime operations required systematic attention to logistical details whose accuracy determined expedition success through proper coordination between navigation planning, supply allocation, and crew selection, favoring experience over enthusiasm among personnel whose survival depended upon professional competence rather than romantic adventure seeking territorial discovery for personal advancement. Captain Manuel de Sousa commanded vessel Nossa Senhora da Conceição, whose crew represented Portuguese maritime expertise through veterans of African and Brazilian operations. Their experience serving reconnaissance mission, requiring reliable observation and systematic documentation rather than aggressive territorial occupation, whose pursuit could compromise diplomatic relations with competing powers claiming similar exploration rights throughout disputed Atlantic waters. Departure from Tagus Harbor occurred during atmospheric conditions that created subtle environmental irregularities affecting normal navigation procedures through minor deviations in tide timing, wind direction, and celestial positioning, whose mathematical relationships enabled standard dead reckoning calculations, serving Portuguese maritime operations throughout established territorial waters. Known landmarks displayed slight configurational differences requiring compass verification and distance measurement, whose results contradicted established navigational understanding developed through decades of systematic observation and cartographic documentation serving Portuguese coastal navigation, whose accuracy enabled reliable harbor approach and departure procedures throughout domestic territorial waters, whose behavior followed predictable patterns supporting commercial and military operations. Initial oceanic progress proceeded according to conventional navigation procedures, despite accumulating evidence suggesting environmental modifications affecting normal Atlantic behavior through current direction, wave pattern, and atmospheric pressure variations, whose systematic nature exceeded random weather fluctuation, affecting maritime operations throughout Portuguese territorial waters. Compass readings required frequent verification through celestial positioning, whose mathematical accuracy confirmed magnetic irregularities affecting bearing calculations, whose reliability served navigation precision throughout Atlantic operations, while distance measurements consistently produced results that contradicted dead reckoning calculations based upon established understanding of wind and current effects, enabling speed estimation, serving navigation accuracy throughout Portuguese maritime operations. Most disturbing was recognition that environmental deviations consistently influenced course direction toward geographic coordinates matching disputed territorial position, despite navigation planning designed to approach target area through indirect routing serving safety objectives requiring cautious rather than aggressive exploration of unconfirmed territorial possibilities, whose investigation demanded systematic rather than reckless methodology. As they near the island's coordinates, the boundary between known geography and something else becomes visible through environmental impossibilities that challenge the crew's understanding of oceanic reality. The approach to disputed coordinates occurred under atmospheric conditions, whose regularity suggested artificial rather than natural weather patterns affecting oceanic environment through mechanisms that operated beyond conventional meteorological understanding, governing Atlantic climate behavior, whose predictability enabled Portuguese navigation throughout imperial territories, requiring reliable environmental conditions for successful maritime operations serving commercial and administrative objectives spanning territorial distances. Wind maintained consistent direction and velocity despite normal variation patterns that characterized Atlantic weather systems, while wave formation displayed geometric precision that challenged natural oceanic behavior through systematic repetition of identical configurations, whose mathematical relationships exceeded random water movement, affected by atmospheric forces operating according to established physical principles governing maritime environmental conditions. Celestial observation revealed positioning irregularities that contradicted established astronomical relationships, enabling navigation calculation throughout Portuguese Atlantic operations. Stars displaying slight angular displacement, affecting bearing measurements, whose accuracy served maritime positioning requirements across territorial waters, whose geographic certainty enabled reliable communication and commercial efficiency. The distortion operated systematically rather than randomly, affecting stellar positions according to patterns that seemed to concentrate celestial mechanics around specific oceanic coordinates, matching theoretical island position, despite continued absence of visible territorial features corresponding to provisional chart configuration, whose accuracy had been established through recovered expedition documentation and archival research spanning decades of Portuguese exploration throughout disputed Atlantic waters. The horizon displayed characteristics that challenged visual perception trained through professional experience, with oceanic observation serving navigation requirements throughout Portuguese maritime operations, atmospheric disturbance creating optical effects that suggested territorial presence through mechanisms that operated beyond normal geographic manifestation, yet remained detectable through systematic observation, requiring careful attention to environmental details whose significance exceeded casual recognition. Distance measurement became unreliable through instruments whose accuracy had been verified through established calibration procedures, serving Portuguese navigation precision. Readings suggesting proximity to coastal features whose existence contradicted oceanic depth measurements, confirming deep water according to conventional oceanographic understanding, developed through systematic exploration of Atlantic waters, whose behavior generally followed predictable patterns, enabling reliable navigation procedures throughout Portuguese territorial operations. Standing at vessel's prow, while Nossa Senhora de Conceição approached coordinates that mathematical certainty insisted contained only Atlantic depths, Vasco recognized environmental conditions whose impossibility exceeded rational explanation through conventional navigation science, yet demanded acknowledgement through professional observation whose accuracy had been established through decades of cartographic precision serving Portuguese territorial expansion across previously unknown waters. The sea ahead displayed behavior that suggested interaction with geographic features whose presence remained invisible despite obvious effects upon wave pattern, current direction, and atmospheric pressure, whose systematic modification indicated proximity to territorial mass, whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about reality's structure and geographic possibility within cosmic framework, that apparently honored different principles governing space and position than conventional understanding could accommodate through established scientific methodology, serving practical navigation requirements throughout Portuguese Atlantic operations. At first light, the island materializes undeniably before the fleet, yet every attempt to approach reveals that proximity itself has become impossible. Dawn revealed what charts had promised, yet reason had denied. coastline rising from Atlantic waters whose depth measurements insisted upon oceanic void, while visual evidence confirmed territorial presence through geographic features that matched provisional documentation despite mathematical impossibility of land existing at coordinates whose emptiness had been verified through centuries of Portuguese navigation. The island possessed configuration that consciousness recognized, despite rational understanding that such familiarity required direct observation impossible through current circumstances, its shores displaying characteristics that honored both cartographic accuracy and environmental reality whose coexistence challenged fundamental assumptions about geographic possibility and navigation science. Serving practical maritime operations throughout established Portuguese territorial waters. Nossa Senhora da Conceição approached through oceanic conditions whose behavior contradicted normal Atlantic characteristics, current direction, and wave patterns suggesting proximity to coastal features, while distance measurements indicated continued separation from territorial mass, whose presence remained visually confirmed, yet mathematically unreachable, according to instruments whose accuracy had been established through systematic calibration procedures. Each league of forward progress produced positioning calculations that placed vessel farther from destination rather than closer. Compass readings describing circular rather than linear movement despite wind conditions that should enable direct approach toward territorial objective, whose achievement represented mission success, serving Portuguese exploration goals requiring systematic rather than impossible navigation procedures. Captain de Sousa ordered repeated approach attempts through different compass bearings, whose mathematical precision should enable successful coastal contact, according to established navigation principles governing Portuguese maritime operations throughout Atlantic territories. Yet each effort produced identical results through mechanisms that operated beyond conventional understanding of oceanic space and geographic relationship. The island maintained visual presence while remaining eternally distant through spatial distortion that honored neither mathematical measurement nor physical movement. Its coastline displaying consistent detail despite inability to achieve proximity through conventional seamanship, whose competence had been established through successful completion of challenging navigation assignments serving Portuguese territorial expansion across previously unknown waters, whose behavior generally followed predictable patterns, enabling reliable approach and harbor assessment procedures. As navigation instruments fail and measurements contradict themselves, Vasco realizes the chart never guided ships to the island. It bound the island to reality itself. Recognition arrived through accumulated evidence whose impossibility exceeded rational dismissal despite professional training. Emphasizing systematic observation and mathematical verification, serving navigation accuracy throughout Portuguese maritime operations across territorial waters whose behavior followed established patterns, enabling reliable positioning calculation and course planning. The provisional chart had not functioned as conventional navigation tool enabling territorial approach, according to standard oceanic procedures, but rather as mechanism binding theoretical possibility to geographic reality through cartographic representation that anchored anomalous territorial mass within Atlantic space, whose normal characteristics should prevent such manifestation according to established understanding of oceanic environment and navigation science, serving practical seamanship requirements. Instrument failure proceeded systematically rather than randomly. Compass needles describing movement patterns that suggested response to magnetic forces operating according to different physical principles than conventional terrestrial magnetism, whose predictable behavior enabled Portuguese navigation throughout established territorial waters. Celestial measurements produced calculations whose mathematical accuracy remained internally consistent, yet contradicted known astronomical relationships governing stellar positioning and Earth's geographic structure, suggesting cosmic environment whose characteristics honored alternative geometric principles operating beyond normal spacetime configuration, affecting oceanic reality through mechanisms that challenged fundamental assumptions about universe's structure and natural law governing navigation science. The chart itself displayed modifications that occurred without human intervention, ink spreading across parchment surface according to patterns that enhanced, rather than corrupted, geographic representation while creating detailed coastal features whose accuracy exceeded original documentation through systematic addition of information that consciousness recognized as authentic, despite impossibility of such knowledge through conventional observation or cartographic survey. Most disturbing was recognition that elimination of chart would not resolve territorial anomaly whose existence had been established through cartographic acknowledgement rather than physical discovery. The island achieving stable reality through documentation whose destruction might release rather than eliminate geographic possibility, whose nature transcended normal relationship between representation and actuality governing conventional mapping procedures, serving Portuguese navigation throughout Atlantic territories. Vasco orders the chart burned, but the island's outline persists as a luminous afterimage, revealing that some geographic realities transcend physical documentation. The command emerged through recognition that cartographic elimination represented sole remaining option for resolving navigation crisis, whose continuation threatened crew safety and mission objectives, serving Portuguese territorial interests requiring practical rather than impossible oceanic exploration according to conventional maritime procedures, whose effectiveness had been established through systematic application across Atlantic waters, whose behavior generally honored predictable patterns, enabling reliable navigation calculation and territorial approach. The parchment accepted flame with normal combustible behavior, ink and prepared hide yielding to fire according to established chemical processes governing material destruction through oxidation and thermal decomposition, whose reliability served practical applications throughout Portuguese administrative and maritime operations requiring document disposal for security or accuracy maintenance purposes. Yet coastal configuration persisted despite complete material elimination through combustion, whose thoroughness eliminated physical evidence of cartographic representation while leaving geometric impression suspended within atmospheric space according to optical phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of light behavior and visual perception, governing normal observation procedures throughout Portuguese navigation operations. The glowing outline maintained precise geographic detail, whose accuracy honored original provisional documentation while displaying luminescent characteristics that operated independently of external illumination sources, suggesting manifestation through mechanisms that transcended normal relationship between documentation and represented reality, whose interaction generally followed established principles governing cartographic utility and geographic representation. The luminous afterimage provided navigation reference whose accuracy enabled successful departure from disputed coordinates, despite continued instrument irregularities affecting compass readings and celestial calculation throughout oceanic region, whose environmental characteristics challenged conventional understanding of Atlantic behavior and geographic stability. Nossa Senhora de Conceição achieved separation from territorial anomaly through conventional sailing procedures, whose effectiveness suggested restoration of normal oceanic conditions operating according to established physical principles governing wind, current, and magnetic forces enabling Portuguese navigation throughout Atlantic territories, whose predictable characteristics served practical maritime operations requiring reliable rather than impossible environmental behavior affecting crew safety and mission completion, serving administrative objectives whose achievement required systematic rather than supernatural methodology. Years later, Vasco dies quietly. His charts remain perfectly accurate except for one persistent blank space that resists all attempts at completion or correction. The return voyage proceeded through Atlantic waters, whose normal characteristics enabled conventional navigation procedures despite psychological impact, affecting crew members whose maritime experience included encounter with oceanic phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about geographic reality and navigation science governing Portuguese territorial operations throughout established shipping routes. Administrative debriefing emphasized conventional explanations attributing navigation difficulties to magnetic irregularities, current anomalies, and atmospheric disturbance whose effects could simulate territorial presence, while remaining consistent with established understanding of Atlantic environmental behavior whose predictability served Portuguese maritime operations, requiring reliable rather than impossible oceanic conditions, affecting commercial and military objectives spanning imperial territories. Vasco resumed cartographic duties, whose precision served Portuguese navigation requirements throughout Atlantic waters, whose behavior had returned to normal patterns, enabling reliable chart production and geographic documentation serving territorial planning and administrative coordination across colonial territories, whose communication depended upon accurate rather than speculative mapping procedures. Professional reputation remained intact through systematic completion of navigation assignments, whose accuracy honored established standards governing Portuguese cartographic excellence. Yet private awareness included geographic knowledge whose nature exceeded conventional understanding, while remaining impossible to document through official channels favoring institutional security over disruptive evidence threatening navigation confidence and territorial certainty. The final charts displayed comprehensive accuracy serving Portuguese navigation throughout Atlantic territories, whose geographic representation enabled reliable maritime operations across colonial territories, requiring precise rather than speculative cartographic documentation, yet single margin consistently resisted completion through mechanisms that operated beyond normal archival procedures, governing document preparation and geographic representation. The blank space maintained island configuration, whose outline suggested territorial presence while preventing inscription of coastal detail, whose absence created navigation gap that consciousness recognized as significant despite inability to resolve through conventional cartographic methodology serving practical navigation requirements. In archives where maritime documentation accumulated through generations of Portuguese exploration, whose systematic precision enabled territorial expansion across previously unknown waters, the incomplete chart remained among materials whose accuracy served navigation operations throughout established shipping routes, its persistent blank serving as reminder that oceanic immensity contained geographic possibilities whose reality transcended human capacity for documentation, while honoring depths that remembered what institutional convenience preferred to forget.